Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. War clouds are gathering in Eastern Europe as Russian troops mass on the border with Ukraine and the two countries exchange threats. The United States is contemplating sending lethal assistance to Ukraine, and President Biden was pressed on the issue of the potential U.S. response in his press conference this past week. But to really understand what's going on, it helps to go back far more than a week and to understand the history of the post-Cold War expansion of NATO, as well as Russia's position vis-a-vis this expansion. And in order to do that, we listened this week to a book talk that was recorded in November at the Clements Center between Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center, and Professor Mary Cerati, the Kravis Professor at Johns Hopkins University, a researcher at Harvard Center for European Studies, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Cerati discusses her book, Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. This book is a fascinating insight into how it is that the security structure in Europe came to be centered around NATO, and how NATO came to expand all the way to the borders with Russia, and how Russia perceives that expansion in terms of its own security. Cerati is interviewed by Clements Center Executive Director Will Inboden, and the event was held at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas, Austin. Let's listen in.
My name is Will Inboden. I'm the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security here at the University of Texas at Austin, and very honored to introduce and host our guest speaker today, a longtime friend of mine, actually going back to graduate school days, Professor Mary Cerati. Mary currently holds the Kravis Chair at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, really one of the premier international policy graduate programs in the country. She's the author of a number of award-winning books. Has really been one of our the most path-breaking historians, especially of Europe, of our generation. And among my fellow historians, Mary is particularly revered for being just an indefatigable archive hound, we might say. If there are any documents related to any important historical episode in any country that Mary is studying, you can be sure that she will find that, track them down and find them. But for Mary, history is not just an antiquarian exercise of digging up musty, interesting tidbits from the past for its own sake. Rather, both given her role of teaching at a leading policy school and as a foreign policy expert, she shares our interest here at the Clements Center in how can the insights of history be brought to bear on current policy challenges. And so as we'll be hearing about in a little bit here with her fantastic new book, titled Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of the Post-Cold War Stalemate. There, she's holding up the fresh copy just hot off the press. Our copies at the Clements Center are arriving tomorrow. We had hoped they'd be here today in time, but anyway, you can see it there. Available, of course, at Amazon and leading booksellers near you. And Emily, if you can put the Amazon link in the chat room too, so people can see it. Anyway, encourage all of you to buy and read the book. But it is at once a really interesting new history of American foreign policy and U.S.-Russia relations at the end of the Cold War into the 1990s, but also has some pretty trenchant insights for U.S.-Russia relations, U.S.-Europe relations today, and we'll be covering both of those. So I'm going to introduce Mary. She's going to share some brief opening comments. Setting the scene for this, then I'm going to put a number of questions to her as a dialogue, and then we'll turn it over to taking questions from our audience. So anyway, Mary, if we're all in person, you'd hear a warm round of applause. So it's great to have you with us on the screen. Over to you. Let's hear from you on kind of setting the scene for this really terrific new book.
Yeah, thank you so much, Will, for inviting me. It's so wonderful to be in Austin via Zoom. I love Austin, one of my favorite cities in America. I've been there a number of times. Also going to College Station to work at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library as well. So I hope to be able to do a follow-up in person as soon as possible. Yeah, so this book, let me just make 4 quick points, because what I really like to do is have a conversation with you. So the first point is about today's format. When Will was kind enough to invite me, I said, Will, rather than my inflicting my PowerPoints on the audience, I'd really like to have a conversation with you, because during the pandemic, I became a podcast addict. And I realized that the podcasts that I liked the most were ones that were a conversation between two knowledgeable parties. And I felt like I was eavesdropping on, a really interesting conversation. So I thought, hey, why don't I try to bring that same spirit to my book events? So I'm glad that you were willing to do that with me. So that's the origin of the format today. Let me just make a few quick remarks, secondly, about the title. So the title is Not 1 Inch. And as many of you in the audience may know, that's a reference to the by now infamous comment by Secretary of State James Baker to the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, in February 1990. So the context is important. The Berlin Wall has come down in November 1989, and that means the Cold War order is crumbling too. And so the question is, what is going to follow it? And there's frantic diplomacy and maneuvering in all major transatlantic capitals to try to find answers for that question. And so James Baker goes to Moscow to meet with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. And as part of a hypothetical conversation, I stress hypothetical, James Baker says, how about something like this? Now I'm paraphrasing, but the exact quotations are in the book. He says, Mikhail Gorbachev, how about you let your part of Germany go, and we agree that NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. In other words, NATO will stay forever frozen on the Cold War line, the dividing line that as it existed in 1989 between Eastern and Western Germany. And Mikhail Gorbachev says something to the effect of, that sounds interesting. There certainly shouldn't be an extension of NATO, but nothing is formalized or written down. And when Baker gets home to Washington, he very quickly realizes that he's leaned too far forward. He's out of step with his boss, President George H.W. Bush. President Bush has a different approach, which is he does want NATO to be able to move eastward. In other words, President Bush has decided that the future of European security means not only keeping NATO, but also keeping NATO's ability to expand. Because otherwise, among other things, divided Germany is going to be half in and half out of NATO, which is going to be, a very big security challenge. So George H.W. Bush makes clear to Baker that he has a slightly different conception, which is that NATO will move across the Cold War line into Eastern Germany, but he'll make concessions as he does so. In other words, George H.W. Bush will recognize the fact that the cost per inch of NATO expansion as it moves closer to Moscow goes up. And so he'll make concessions so that it can move beyond the Cold War line. And this has, by the way, the interesting consequence that to this day, the territory of former East Germany, not all of Germany, just former East Germany, is the only part of Europe that is guaranteed by treaty to be nuclear free. That was one of the concessions that the Bush administration made. So it turns out that Baker's saying not 1 inch was not an accurate reflection of Bush's thinking. And so Baker quietly has to let allies know, stop using that language, it's creating confusion. But it takes Moscow a while to notice. And so that controversy, as you know, is the heart of the Russian claim to this day that they were betrayed, that was a promise, and that they absolutely should, have been able to rely on that. Now, I have a different view because it was only a hypothetical spoken conversation. And when you're at this kind of elite level of interaction, you really need things to be written down. But certainly the issue was discussed. Now, the reason I chose to make that into the title of the book, however, is that I realized in my research that as important as that conversation was, more important was the decade to follow. The book is an in-depth examination of the 1990s. And I realized those three words over the course of the 1990s took on the exact opposite meaning. As the Berlin Wall came down, Germany unified, and then most significantly, the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago this December. Here I am, by the way, my background. I've taken a time machine back to 1991. I'm here with Boris Yeltsin on a tank in front of the Russian parliament. So 30 years ago, there were this tumultuous sequence of events, which we can talk about if you want to, that lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And once the Soviet Union collapses, Washington realizes that it can not only win big, but it can win bigger. And it realizes that not 1 inch of European territory needs to be off limits to NATO. And so the book is a story of that shift in meaning and not 1 inch. From the Baker meaning of it won't move 1 inch eastward to not 1 inch needs to be off limits. Then let me just say third, a little bit about the sources. Because I'm a historian, I need to work from, as you said, primary sources. And thank you, Will, for your kind words about my tenacity in hunting down sources. And when I realized I wanted to talk in a serious way about the 90s, this meant that I needed to get documents out of the Clinton Library. So I filed many hundreds of Freedom of Information Act and mandatory review requests. And when those did not initially succeed, I then went through an appeals process with what's known as ISCAP, ISCAP, the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, an organization I know you know well too, Will. And so I actually succeeded in my appeals with the Clinton Library, meaning that I got most of the records from Clinton-Yeltsin summits released. And I knew I must be getting something good because the Kremlin complained about my release when it became public that I'd won my appeal and the Clinton Library was going to release to me and everyone else. The rule is open for one, open for all. Yeah. These summit records, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, complained because he said these documents covered currently serving politicians, above all his boss, because Putin is all over these documents because he was working for Yeltsin. So I knew what I was about to get must be good, and the book is based on that. And then just finally, these historical details, you're going to hear a lot of historical details in my conversation with Will. I just want to put them in context and say, these events aren't just dusty old history. To this day, Putin cites these events as justification for what he is doing now. For example, when he annexed Crimea, he gave a speech at the Kremlin saying, I'm justified in doing this because NATO betrayed its pledge and moved infrastructure to our borders. Earlier this year, he started talking about it again. Now, obviously, Putin is repurposing a lot of this history and he's rewriting a lot of the history. But the point is that it is still an issue of deep, deep contention between the United States and Russia now. And one particularly big question is how this relates to Ukraine, because as I discovered in my story, speculation about the future of Ukraine and how necessary it was to find a solution for Ukraine to avoid giving hostages to fortune for the future, that was a big factor of discussions in the 90s. And now, of course, that's a huge issue to this day as Russian troops are apparently massing on the Ukrainian border. So what we're talking about, it's going to be a lot of historical details, but it has a real world impact right now. So those are just some overview points. And Will, I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this period and start our discussion.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So although let me just first mention, because I know we have a number of our PhD students tuned in and some young scholars as well, and also for our audience. When Mary talks about her very tenacious efforts to get those documents declassified by the Clinton Library and going through that several-year process with the U.S. government, that, of course, was a big help to her book. But it's a huge service she's performing for the scholarly community, because once those documents are declassified, as she said, they're available to everybody. And so I know you use them, but they're now available to other young scholars who otherwise would not have had access to them. So any PhD students looking for a dissertation topic, there's some really good documents on U.S.-Russia relations in the 90s available too. So, so Mary, let's come back to the question of the origins of this book and how and why you decided to write it. And as you well know, but just to remind our audience, before Mary's book came along, there already had been some really interesting scholarly work done on this NATO debate by scholars like Jim Goldgeier and Josh Schifrinson and Mark Kramer and John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt. Take various different positions on it. And it's a very fraught debate, so much so that even the nomenclature is contended. So people who are critical of the decision to, let's say, grow NATO, call it NATO expansion. And people who supported it call it NATO enlargement. And I noticed that you very artfully kind of use both terms there. So anyway, given that a lot of work had already been done on this, given that it's a very fraught, contentious debate, how and why did you decide to dive in and take it up? What was the opening you saw for some new findings, which you certainly did find, but you might not have known that when you were starting the project, right? So tell us where you got the idea to do this book.
Sure. Well, in essence, although I didn't know it, my research started back in 1989 when I was studying abroad in West Berlin and witnessing those
as an 8-year-old, I should say.
A three-year-old,
of
course. Yeah. And so I was, of course, fascinated by everything I was seeing around me. And that year abroad was the end of my not very promising pre-med career and the start of my only somewhat more promising academic career. And I decided that I wanted to understand what was happening around me in a significant way. And so once I was lucky enough to get into the grad program in history at Yale, I decided to focus on the history of the division of Europe and the end of the Cold War in my research. So already in 1989, I had started saving materials. And then in the 1990s, I started doing interviews and working in all the great sources in Eastern Europe that had suddenly become available in basically, former East Germany and former Warsaw Pact. As your listeners might know, government documents are generally kept closed for decades because that protects current political actors. They need to know that if they're writing something today, it's not just going to appear in the newspaper tomorrow. But when these Warsaw Pact states collapsed, there was no one to keep the archive doors locked. And so, suddenly in 1990, it became possible in East Germany to research 1990. And so I spent a lot of time, among other things, in the Stasi, or East German Secret Police Archive. And so I wrote a book, as you know. I wrote a book called "The Collapse: The Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall," which is a really focused, detailed account of how the wall came down. If your audience is interested in that,
and then read, by the way, yeah.
Thank you. And then I realized at some point that all these Eastern sources, they actually helped me to get Western sources, because I knew quite a bit about what I was looking for in the West. And as you know, when you're trying to get these sources declassified in the West, it's often a guessing game. You've got to kind of guess what's in there. But because I had these Eastern sources and German sources, it made me a better guesser. And my requests started to gain traction in the United States. And so I got very interested in the questions of how German unification happened. And I also wrote another book about German unification called 1989, The Struggle to Create Post-Cold War Europe. And in the course of writing this book, that was when I came across the early origins of NATO expansion, which really surprised me. So I published a couple articles in 2010 where I brought out the documents of that discussion I've just described to you between Baker and Gorbachev. And that theme kind of stayed with me of the origins of NATO expansion. And at some point, I realized that I actually needed to write a loose trilogy of books. I realized, especially because there was so much interest in it, that I should look not just at the events of 1989 from the point of view of the people who thought they were joyous and triumphant. In other words, these previous books have happy endings. The wall comes down, Germany unifies. It's about the people who are happy about that. I realized I should revisit the era and look at the people for whom the wall coming down was a disaster. Above all, Vladimir Putin, who was, of course, in East Germany as a KGB agent. And I thought, there's another way to frame the end of the Cold War, which is, what if we take a non-triumphalist view of the end of the Cold War and say that the most important consequence of the end of the Cold War was the education and later rise of Putin? Right? What if we look at the end of the Cold War that way? If we look back, 50 years from now, will that seem like the most important event? And so then I started also thinking, of course, as all Americans have, about what went wrong in relations between America and Russia that led to the hacking of elections. And I realized, I had more to say. I realized that what I could do was go back to the end of the Cold War, but as I said, look at it from the point of view of the people like Putin who saw it as a disaster, look at the people who did not see it as a happy ending, and look at the fight between the U.S. and Russia over NATO expansion as a way of examining what went wrong between the U.S. and Russia. It's not the only thing that went wrong. It's not a monocausal book. I don't say because of NATO expansion, U.S.-Russian relations derailed. That's not what I say. That's John Mearsheimer. If you guys are looking for that argument, go see John Mearsheimer. But I do follow this through line as the way of understanding how the relations decayed. And it was really interesting for me because in the course of writing the book, as I said, on the one hand, I had new declassification breakthroughs, which was the Clinton Library. But on the other hand, in some cases, I was going back to the notes I used for my 2010 article on NATO expansion, or even going farther back. I pulled up my tapes of my interviews from the 1990s of people who passed away. So it was an interesting experience for me to really bring together a lot of the research I'd done over a lot of years.
Great. So again, a wonderful example of kind of an intellectual odyssey there, and how our current research can be building on ideas we were first encountering or thinking about much earlier in our careers. So,
how did you get in Reagan, by the way? I'm interested in hearing from you.
So, we'll save that fuller one until the whole book comes out. But I kind of stumbled into it when I was doing a separate history of the National Security Council, and then realized there was a real opening with a lot of the new Reagan archive documents to tackle that one more in depth. So, but we'll come back to that another time when that book's out. Here's about you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the actual argument that you make in your book. And again, to give our listeners a certain appreciation for this, kind of two particular nuances with Mary's argument I want to bring out, and then we're going to ask you to elaborate on it. The first is a lot of the scholarship on the NATO enlargement or expansion decision falls into these binary traps of it was either a good policy that the U.S. did and was justified, or is a bad idea and the U.S. shouldn't have done it. Mary, you can elaborate on this, but you take a more nuanced view of, overall you are still supportive of the expansion or enlargement of NATO, but you're much more critical of how it was done. And the second thing, and again, just picking up for our viewers, is you mentioned that it's not monocausal. And so, you do spend quite a bit of time on American policy, appropriately so. You make clear that some of the negative outcomes that we're dealing with were not only the result of American policy, but Russian policy, Yeltsin and then Putin as well. And so there's more complexity to this story, which may not be so fun for our debating points, but it's much more, I think, true to life of how history really unfolds. But anyway, tell us more about your main argument. And particularly, you identified sort of three key decisions, one by the Bush administration and two by the Clinton administration, that you think were, well, I'll let you tell us more, but essentially the missed opportunities or the ways in which the process was not handled as well as it could have been.
In the book, I try to move us beyond the binary. What I mean by that is, for a long time, the debate over NATO expansion was a binary one. Either you thought NATO expansion was good or you thought it was bad. Either you thought it was a genius move and it was fortunate we did it as soon as possible, or you thought, like George Kennan, it was the biggest strategic blunder of the post-Cold War world. And I'm trying to add nuance and say, that is too simplistic. NATO expansion wasn't one thing. There were multiple ways to expand NATO. And there was actually a spectrum of possibilities for the way NATO could have expanded. So the problem wasn't NATO expansion itself. The problem was how it happened. There were a number of alternatives considered. And in the United States, we ended up expanding in the way that maximized friction with Moscow at a particularly significant moment. I like to say that Cold Wars are not short-lived affairs. And so thaws are precious. I think we're, discussing some of these thoughts now with relation to China. And because of the way that NATO expanded during this precious moment of the thaw, it had an outsized impact on U.S.-Russian relations. So what do I mean by that? Well, as you mentioned, the idea of the ratchet turns. This is an idea I raised in the book to kind of provide an overview of the argument. Let me back up and say there is so much going on in the 1990s. Moving into the 1990s historically, it's exciting, but it's kind of bewildering. You have the Soviet Empire collapsing. You have, 20 new Eurasian states emerging. You have dissidents rising from prisons to presidency, winning Nobel Prizes, earning global admiration, and, reshaping their countries. The 90s opened the door to new forms of democratization, neoliberalism, the spread of the tenets of liberal international order. But the 90s also opened the door to ethnic cleansing in the Balkans and to new forms of de-democratization and populism. So there is just a ton going on in the 1990s. And of course, in the United States, you've got Bill Clinton, who's a big character. You've got the Bill and Boris bromance, and you've got the blue dress with Monica Lewinsky. You've got betrayal, and that's just the letter B. So there is so much going on in the 1990s that you need a story to follow to get from the beginning to the end. And so the story I'm following is of the fight between the US and Russia over NATO expansion. And so to try to provide an overview to this massive, sprawling story, the book is like 500 pages long, I use this idea of ratchet turns. And what I mean by that is a decision that forecloses other options, because a ratchet is a tool that will turn in one direction only. So once you've turned it, you're done, right? So basically, you have at the end of the Cold War, you have what I like to call this punctuational moment. And that comes out of, to backtrack again, a theory by the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, which I like to use in my writing. I find it very compelling. Some of your audience might know this already. I often cite it when I'm explaining my thinking on this time period. Basically, Stephen Jay Gould, as an evolutionary biologist, he used to argue that when he looked at the fossil record, he did not see a little evolution one day, and then a little evolution another day, and then a little evolution the next day. In other words, he did not see gradualism. Instead, what he saw were long periods of relative stasis or equilibrium, where there were small changes, but nothing major. And then there would be a dramatic punctuational event, most famously a giant asteroid slamming into the Earth, throwing up a huge shroud of dust, and that shroud being so thick that it cooled the temperature of the Earth below that at which dinosaurs could survive. So you have a mass extinction event where the dinosaurs die out, and that opens the door to a new stasis or equilibrium, which is one dominated by mammals. So you have these kind of stasis or equilibrium periods, and then you have these dramatic punctuational moments. And in these punctuational moments, that's when you have multiple paths forward to the future, multiple timelines forward to the future. And in those punctuational moments, contingency and agency take on an outsized role. That's why they're so great for historians like us, because we can really dive in deep and study the agency. And as political actors make decisions during those punctuational moments, they gradually close off certain timelines to the future until you actually get the timeline that we're on. And so these ratchet turns are those turns where you've foreclosed other options. You've decided to move in one direction. And so I argue there were three of these, one under President George H.W. Bush and two under Bill Clinton. And so the first one, briefly, under George H.W. Bush, is the decision that the post-Cold War security order will be based on NATO. Now, there are other people at the time saying, hey, let's do different things. Let's do pan-European security, or let's demilitarize Central Europe. That was a serious call from pacifists who were now presidents of their countries. But Bush decided that he wanted to perpetuate not only NATO, but also its ability to expand. Both of those are important. And I've argued that this is not surprising. As political scientists know, institutions are sticky. So once you have a big institution, it's like NATO or an organization, it's probably going to persist. What is surprising was the ability of the Bush administration to label this a new world order, since it was not. It was a perpetuation of the key structure of transatlantic relations in the Cold War period, which makes sense. From Washington's point of view, we just won the Cold War. As George H.W. Bush said, I don't do the vision thing. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So it makes sense from Washington's point of view to perpetuate NATO. It's just not new. So then that's the first ratchet turn, because it means these other options for security are not going to happen. So now you've foreclosed some options. Bush then loses office. So it's up to Clinton to take the next choices, which are how you expand NATO. He then executes the second ratchet turn, which is a decision to expand NATO in a slow, phased, diffuse manner. He decided to set up an organization called the Partnership for Peace, which would allow countries to first have a loose affiliation with the partnership and through that gradually gain NATO membership. And this, I think, was a great idea because it put NATO membership at the end rather than at the beginning of a process. It allowed countries time to get their militaries interoperable with NATO. It avoided an immediate beauty contest between, who will be first. And as President Clinton himself said, it does not draw a new line across Europe. And he was particularly concerned, and this amazed me, about Ukraine. I was just shocked in my research how much President Clinton focused on Ukraine. And he said things like, without defining a berth for Ukraine in European security, we're never going to have lasting peace in Europe. And I'm reading this, as Russian troops are, sitting in Ukraine and thinking, wow, that's really prescient. So Clinton said, we're going to have this diffuse organization to expand NATO because that means post-Soviet states like Ukraine can be affiliated. We don't want to leave them in the lurch. Now, the Poles didn't like it because they wanted to be in NATO yesterday. But the argument that convinced them was the following. Clinton said, the Poles, should, above all people, understand the importance of not drawing a new line across Europe because you got left behind the Yalta line. So the Poles don't love it, but through clenched teeth, they agree to participate. The Russians don't love it either, but they also agree to participate. So in other words, the Partnership for Peace was a workable compromise that allowed NATO expansion in a way that kept frictions with Moscow manageable. And then the third ratchet turn, Clinton, for a host of reasons I describe in the book, having found what I think was a workable solution, marginalizes it. He changes his mind. Partly he does that because of self-harming Russian choices. When Boris Yeltsin decides to shed the blood of his political opponents in Moscow in 93 and in Chechnya in 94, that makes everyone think, oh, the new Russia is a lot like the old Soviet Union. So maybe we do need neo-containment. And that phrase comes up in the documents. And also in the United States, in the midterm congressional elections of 1994, the Republicans win an amazing victory. They take the House and the Senate. And they do that on the basis of a contract with America that calls for giving Article 5 to countries as soon as possible. None of this phase-in nonsense, all or nothing, Article 5. And so Clinton changes his mind. He marginalizes the Partnership for Peace. It still exists to this day, but it's not that important. And he switches to this all or nothing method, basically denying that the cost per inch of expansion goes up the closer you get to Moscow. And that, combined with other issues, they're cumulative, like tensions over Kosovo, like the economic crisis in Russia, they start to lead to cumulative scarring. And they start to lead to deterioration during this important thaw moment. So by the time you get to the end of the 90s, you're getting into this new equilibrium that is now our reality, which becomes very hard to budge because now it's a settled reality. So that's why these three ratchet turns during that punctuational moment have such a long long tail effect. Sorry for the long answer, but it's a key point in the book.
No, it really is, and thanks. And that's, I think that's, getting to the heart of your argument there. And again, those, I've not seen in any of the other literature highlighting of those as those key inflection points. And as you said, also, scholars are always debating how much is, how international relations driven by structural forces as opposed to individual decisions and contingency, as you said. And you point to some key moments of where individual leadership and decisions make a difference. Let me mention for our audience, I see we're getting some good questions in the Q&A box already, and we'll be getting to those. But others of you, if you have any questions, please do type them into the box. Since once I finish my interrogation of Professor Sarati, we'll be turning to the questions there too. So be putting those in at any time. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Okay, so Mary, a number of directions we can go with this, but I want to turn now to a little bit more some of the what if, the policy applications for this. And let's do it as a counterfactual. And I'm going to push you a little bit here. First of all, it's very clear, as you demonstrate in the book, and as anyone paying attention to current events sees, Putin does point to these, the fact of NATO enlargement and the way that it was done as real grievances, and it does, seem to be a broken trust, and not taking into account Russian security needs. So we can, he and Yeltsin both certainly point to those. But let's ask the counterfactual. Let's say, and we'll point at the Sarati doctrine. So let's say American policymakers had followed the Sarati doctrine of, yes, some sort of expansion or growth in NATO is okay, but it should be done taking much more account of Russian interests, but on the more flexibility of the Partnership for Peace model. Let's say that process had been done. How confident are you that U.S.-Russia relations today would be in a much better spot? Or is there a concern perhaps that if Putin didn't have those as grievances, he would have found other grievances, just because he seems to be kind of a grievance shopper, if you will, right? So how would you answer that counterfactual if the Sarati doctrine had been followed? How much better might things be today?
Yeah, so I like the Sarati doctrine. So important to clarify here.
Everyone should have a doctrine named.
Everyone should have a doctrine. When your book comes out, we'll come up with an Imboden doctrine. By the way, it turned out the Talbot principle, interestingly, was an internal reference to Strobe Talbot, that's Clinton's top Russia advisor, absolute insistence that NATO expansion not stop until it included the Baltics. That really surprised me, just how hard he pressed for that. But to get back to your question, so it's important to clarify here, what I'm arguing is not actually a counterfactual. The Partnership for Peace was policy. It came into existence. So this is not, something that the Sarati doctrine is not, what if we had followed it? The U.S. government was following it. So my counterfactual is that, let me rephrase that, I think we were on the right track, and unfortunately we got off. So my counterfactual is, what if we'd stayed on that track, right? So the institution existed, and I think we had found a way to square the circle. Now, to be clear, I do not believe that had we stayed on the Partnership for Peace track, it would all be wine and roses between us and Moscow. But as our president, Biden, likes to say, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And NATO relations with Russia today are awful. I mean, we're not in a state of actual kinetic shooting war, but we're, the subject of cyber attacks on our elections, on our businesses, on our institutions. Dissidents are ending up dead in foreign capitals. Navalny was poisoned. There was the attack in Berlin and Salisbury. I mean, things are really pretty rough. And I am frankly personally a little worried. We're coming up, of course, as I mentioned, on the 30th anniversary of Soviet collapse. Even though he doesn't say so really clearly in public, Putin is deeply conscious of these anniversaries. It's clear, let me put it this way, he's conscious of anniversaries and birthdays. There's a surprising correlation between the recurrence of Putin's birthday on October 7th and bad things happening to Putin's opponents. He reportedly likes birthday presents. So, for example, the courageous journalist and human rights activist Anna Politkovskaya was murdered on October 7th after she had really become a thorn in Putin's side. So there is this rumor that he likes things to happen on his birthday and he likes things to happen on anniversaries. And of course, on the 25th anniversary of Soviet collapse, that was 2016, that was when Russia massively hacked a presidential election. So now we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of Soviet collapse, and I am worried about what he may have on his mind. I mean, he's not going to say this in public, but there is a clear track record there on birthdays and anniversaries. So given just how awful relations are now, it's kind of a low bar for me to say, there are things we could have done that would have gotten us to a better place. I'm not saying it would have been perfect, but it's clear that the way NATO expansion happens has corrosive effects at a time when the nascent Russian democracy was most in need of friends, right? This was the first time Russia had been a democracy. Yeltsin was the first elected Russian leader. In some ways, it was almost heartbreaking to research this because there's such a spirit of genuine cooperation at the beginning of the 90s, particularly on nuclear issues. There was a genuine commonality of interest between Moscow and Washington in ensuring that there would be only one nuclear successor state to the Soviet Union, and that successor state be Russia. There was an absolute, community and commonality of interest. And in some ways, in the book, I'm following the arguments of Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. Bill Perry, I read quite a bit of his writings and his files in my research, and I was really very impressed by him. I interviewed him as well. Bill Perry's view was roughly as follows. I'm paraphrasing, but all the original quotations are in the book. Bill Perry would go to President Clinton and say repeatedly, look, President Clinton, I admire the Central and Eastern Europeans. I admire how they threw off Soviet domination. I have nothing but the greatest personal admiration for people like Lech Walesa, Polish president, Nobel laureate, Václav Havel. But I am Bill Perry. I am the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America. My job is to make the United States safer. And I'm currently doing an absolutely amazing job because I have cooperation in Moscow in decreasing the number of missiles pointed at the United States. We are relocating the Soviet arsenal back to Russia or dismantling it. We are making bigger strides than ever since the dawn of the atomic age. And so anything you're going to do right now, President Clinton, to irritate the Russians and derail this is not in American interest. Do not move to this, more assertive form of giving Article 5 or nothing to states, drawing a new line across Europe and clearly cutting off Russia. Oh, and by the way, leaving Ukraine in the lurch. Stick to your plan, President Clinton, of not drawing a new line across Europe. And Clinton at first listens to Perry, but then gradually, because of Yeltsin's tragic decisions to shed blood, because of the Republican victory at home, because Ukraine denuclearizes and so becomes less important in Clinton's mind, so leaving it in the lurch seems not so important, Clinton changes his mind. And Perry comes this close to resigning. And in his memoirs, he later said he wished he had. And as he put it, the consequences of premature NATO expansion, not of NATO expansion, but of premature NATO expansion, were even worse than I had feared. And so I basically am following Bill Perry's argument. He also, by the way, it's not just Bill Perry, General John Shalikashvili, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joe Kruzel, who dies tragically, they're all making this argument saying, let's just not do it prematurely. Let's stick with the Partnership for Peace. The frictions with Russia are manageable and we're making progress. And I think that Perry and Shalikashvili and Kruzel were right.
That's actually a great segue to my next question. But and this pivots off your words of praise there for Secretary Perry, someone who I also hold in very high regard. Tell us a little bit more about some of the, and I'm going to overstate this, the heroes and villains in your story, right? So some of the key individuals who, over the course of your research, you either came to appreciate and hold in higher regard, saying, okay, in hindsight, in history's judgments, these people really got it right or had particularly acute insights. And maybe others who, and again, not to cast personal aspersions here or anything, but others who you developed a more critical assessment of, like, okay, that particular person, really got it wrong, or is made some very regrettable decisions. So, or others who you just found, wow, that person's just really interesting. So this is the fun part of history: is the people who helped make it up.
Yeah, I mean, this is very much a character-driven study. And I encourage people to have a look at the book. I also want to give everyone permission not to read the footnotes. If you just want the story, feel free to go ahead and just read the story. There's over 1,800 footnotes, but you don't need to read those. Those are only if you really want to do a deep dive into the evidence yourself. And then when you read the story, you'll see all kinds of unique, shall I say, character anecdotes, such as when Yeltsin, who had a serious drinking problem, this is the Russian president, at the end of a day of summitry, this has been a formal day in Washington with the president of the United States, he goes back to his guest house And let's just say he's had a bit to drink, and no one's quite sure what happens, but suddenly the president of Russia ends up on the street wearing nothing but his underwear, shouting in Russian that he needs a taxi and a pizza. Now, fortunately, his staff notices and gets him back inside. They also get him a pizza, but it also signals just what the West is dealing with. And so the Western side actually at the summits keeps a private running tally of Yeltsin's alcohol intake, which is not just a joke. The problem is after a certain point, you can't get any business done with Yeltsin, right? Now, interestingly, I began to wonder if this was a tactic for Yeltsin, right? Because after a while, if he didn't like what they were talking about, he'd just start, slamming back glasses of wine at lunch, and that would be the end of the conversation. So there's another time when in the Vancouver summit, they're going out on a boat for a tour of the harbor, and the boat has a bar, and he has like 3 scotches before the boat pulls out of the dock. So, those kinds of things come up. I also discovered in the story, and this surprised me, the connections between President Clinton's relationship with Monica Lewinsky and NATO expansion, which if you told me that, 3 or 4 years ago, I would not have believed that. But I, for example, was reading some documents again from another summit where Clinton, who's usually a fairly quick study, Clinton is just out to lunch. His staff is saying to each other, why is he sleepwalking through the summit? Why is he forgetting basic facts? Why is he so distracted? And a light bulb went off in my head, and I decided to go back and reread the Starr report, Monica Lewinsky's deposition, and I put together a timeline of events in the Clinton-Lewinsky relationship. And I already had a timeline of major events in the NATO expansion story. And when I put those 2 timelines together, I realized just how heavily they overlapped. President Clinton's relationship with Monica Lewinsky was, well over 2 years, 95, 96, 97. And then, of course, 98, it comes out in the public. So all of these years overlap. And so there's all these cases, for example, where President Clinton goes right from Monica to the Madrid summit. Now, obviously, he and Monica are not talking about NATO expansion, but it distracts him. It takes time away from his foreign policy team, especially once the affair becomes public. It narrows the parameters he has to maneuver. He needs wins, and NATO expansion is a big win. The foreign policy team can't get to him. So they start saying, it used to be before the president had a meeting with a foreign leader in a press summit or a press conference, the last people in the room would be the foreign policy team to tell him about that foreign leader and give him, tips for the press conference and so forth, give him speaking points. Now it just doesn't happen because he's got to talk to his personal lawyers instead, because all the questions at the press conference are going to be about Monica Lewinsky. So, it's interfering with his ability to get advice and to talk about these issues. The people who are trying to get ratified in the Senate are horrified when the Lewinsky issue breaks because they say, we're trying to get 67 senators to stand up for the president. And now, half of them are saying, I'll be damned if I do anything for that man. He's just given them a weapon on the issue where he's most vulnerable, which is character. So actually, in some ways, you asked about heroes and villains. I mean, it's funny because in the course of the story, I would say, Clinton in some ways goes from hero to villain because he starts off, I think, on the right track. He figures out the partnership piece is a good move. He talks about not drawing a new line across Europe. He talks about the need not to leave Ukraine in the lurch because it will give hostages to fortune. And I'm reading all this in 93, 94 and thinking, yes, right? But then, his thinking starts to shift. He starts to lean towards people who want neo-containment. Strobe Talbot turns out to be a real hardliner, even though he's obviously very knowledgeable about Russia. He feels maybe because he is knowledgeable about Russia, he feels very strongly that NATO expansion needs to happen as soon as possible. You need to give countries Article 5 as soon as possible. You need to get the Baltics in. He has a really hardline approach. So Clinton gets tugged in that way, and then Clinton gets mired in the Lewinsky affair. And Yeltsin is on kind of the same arc from hero to villain. He starts off as a genuine Democrat, someone you really admire, and then he just becomes mired in alcoholism, corruption, trying to protect his family. So their arc, the Bill and Boris arc, is really a fascinating and tragic story. I mean, at first they have the closest relationship ever for 2 presidents ever, any Russian or Soviet leader and an American leader. Clinton goes to Moscow more times than any president before or since. But you can just see this arc, which starts with this romance. And by the end, it's descended into alcohol-fueled tirades where Yeltsin is screaming at Clinton and hanging up on him. And as Talbot says, he's kind of unhinged. And then my foreign affairs article at one point, towards the end, 99, their last meeting while both in office, he just starts yelling, give Europe to Russia, give Europe to Russia. Europe's never felt as close to Russia as it has now. And Clinton's sort of yelling back, I don't think the Europeans would like this. This is kind of unhinged, and you can just sort of see these characters, you can see their hopes being scuttled, and it was in some ways kind of sad about that, to see that happen. So, the other thing that was interesting was the people who aren't necessarily household names. I already mentioned Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, and I had a lot of admiration for his thinking. But I also developed admiration for different reasons for two Russian foreign ministers, Kozyrov and Primakov, thinking, if I were in their shoes, I could see what they were trying to do. It was interesting because Kozyrov is often damned as a very weak foreign minister. But I actually developed quite a bit of respect for him, trying to find a way to keep cooperation with the West going while still keeping democratization at home going. In the end, he's overwhelmed by opposition. But I could see what his motives were. I could understand them. And then Primakov, I also admired, too, as someone who was really tenaciously fighting for his country. If I were trying to hire someone to fight for me, I could see hiring Primakov. Obviously, as an American, I disagreed with some of his positions, but I could see what he was doing. And I remember at one point, I kind of admired this. Strobe Tablet used to like to say, Russia, you don't have a veto on NATO expansion. You don't have a veto on NATO expansion. He would say that all the time. I must have that, 100 times in my notes. And finally, at some point, Primakov just said, Strobe, you keep saying we don't have a veto over NATO expansion. I get it. I've heard you. You said it 100 times. But you're still here talking to me, so I must have something. And I was like, he's right. Clearly, they realized in Washington, you can't just expand NATO because they could just do it. So why are we still talking to Russia? It's because we want to keep that relationship going. The big play in post-Cold War Europe was integrating Russia as a constructive component, as a cooperative partner, rather than alienating it. And that's what we were trying to do. And we didn't really accomplish that. And we made mistakes, and the Russian side made mistakes. And you can just see it kind of falling apart. And in some ways, it just is really tragic.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.